What can we learn by reflecting on the severe difficulties the Union Army Major Merrill faced when attempting to protect the civil rights of newly freed slaves in the Confederate South? We reflected on the story in the book, Bloody Shirt, Terror After the Civil War, to answer a very personal question. How can so many of my Christian friends seem to embrace the false narratives of Fox News and Donald Trump, valuing cruelty over compassion? Why are so many white Christians so against what they call wokeness, against the Black Lives Matter ethos, against civil rights, and against basic kindness? One answer is in this book. It's not a history of the forest of the Jim Crow and Reconstruction from a grand view, and we have many videos on this broad topic. But rather, it is a story of individual communities where Southern citizens, including many white Christians, were quick to support the violent terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan nightriders in the dark days following the Civil War. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. Where does the phrase waving the bloody shirt originate? On one dark midnight, the Ku Klux Klan nightriders galloped where Allen Huggins was staying. They sought to bully and intimidate Huggins, who was the school commissioner, so he would cease and desist from educating the Negro. They beat him with a strap nearly 100 times, kicked him, and pointed their pistols at him and threatened to shoot him. Our author, Stephen Budiansky, writes that Higgins was whipped so ferociously that he could barely walk for a week or two. So ferociously that in a burning anger that overcame any fear of his own death, he traveled to Washington to testify before Congress. And he returned with a deputy marshal's badge, determined to arrest every man he could lay his hands on who had been a part of the KKK murder and terror. His bloody shirt was waved on the floor of Congress in a speech condemning the Ku Klux Klan and their reign of terror, leading to legislation enabling the U.S. Army to finally put down this terrorist movement. Now we'll focus on the career of Major Merrill, who showed considerable bravery in his actions during the Civil War, and some of his exploits are told by our author. Before his post-Civil War task, he was incredulous of the stories told of the Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorist groups. Our author writes what Major Merrill told his commanding officer. The newspaper stories were incredible. Tales of shadowy bands whipping and beating leading Republicans in strange nighttime ceremonies. Of schoolhouses set ablaze. Republican office holders forced to resign on threat of death. Entire towns seized by 1,000 disguised men taking up positions in eerie silence and stringing up a dozen Negroes who had dared to enlist in the state militia. And the chilling reply to Major Merrill was that when you get to South Carolina, you will find that the half has not been told you. And the militia commanded by Major Merrill arrived in the neighboring town on Saturday night. The train to their post in Yorkville in York County in South Carolina was scheduled to depart on Sunday morning, but the Sunday train never arrived. When the train did arrive on Monday morning, the soldiers were told that the track had been damaged, delaying the train for a day. When they pulled into Yorkville later on Monday, there were pretty tree-lined streets of Yorkville were quiet. It was a town of 1,500 people, a number of elegant Georgian and Greek revival houses, several hotels, some palatial, grocery stores, specialty shops, doctors' and lawyers' offices, and a row of substantial church buildings, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian, the last boasting a square Gothic bell tower, and there were many churches in this peaceful town of Yorkville. Later that day, they learned that the day before there had been a disturbance. A band of 100 hooded men had set upon Rose's Hotel, looking to hang Edward Rose, the Republican owner. His hotel was ransacked, but Edward flew out of the back window, fleeing all the way to Canada. A few days after their arrival, leading citizens of the town called on Major Merrill, assuring him that they were opposed to this violence. But what didn't make sense was that the damage to the rails was not extensive. The rotted ties had not been disturbed, and only one rail had been leaned up against the tree. Rails had not been wrapped around any trees, as was often done during the Civil War. Once the Sunday disturbance was over, it took less than an hour to fix the tracks. The incident was not even mentioned in the paper. Major Merrill learned from an informer who conspired to run Edward Rose out of town. The railroad men, the sheriff and deputies, the newspaper editor, nearly every white in town was in on it. These leading citizens met with Major Merrill. They said they were opposed to violence. They pointed to an editorial in the local Inquirer that denounced the violence, doubted the violence would recur, and that any further violence would be surely put down by the power of the federal government. Who was to blame for this outrage? The editorial pointed fingers, saying that although the violence was not justified, that the Negro radical government of this state was responsible for all the evils that are upon us. The Negroes had refused to vote with the segregationist Democrats. Instead, the black vote was massed against the white man. And he further said that the retaliation on Sunday afternoon was inevitable. Threatened by the bayonets of our former slaves, insultingly and defiantly marching by day and night through the peaceful country and in the thronged streets, tormented to madness by 1,000 acts of injustice and tyranny, retaliation must and has commenced. The guilty perpetrators of crime and outrage have been overtaken and scourged. It was the result of their aggression. In other words, they were blaming the victim. The editorial resolved that the existing Negro government of South Carolina is a reproach to the civilization of the age, a stain upon the manhood of an intelligent and gallant people who have so long and so patiently endured and submitted to be ruled by former slaves. We are tired of it and will exert every legitimate and constitutional means to effect a change. Now, for about 3 weeks there was peace in the county, and all the townspeople were friendly to Major Merrill. But then the KKK showed up at a plantation searching for a Negro man who fled. So they severely beat his Negro father instead for not properly bringing up his son. Many Negroes knew who the guilty white men were. They were eager to inform our Major who they were, but they refused in fear for their lives to testify in court. Major Merrill says that he knew that the Ku Klux Klan is greater in numbers than is commonly supposed, and that a large number of the most respectable people in the county are more or less intimately connected with it. The debauched sentiment of the old slaveholding community sees no great offense in whipping a Negro for being a radical. The old sentiment is rife, where differences of opinion are settled by killing the man who dares to disagree with them. And Major Merrill got to work documenting crimes recently committed by the KKK, including 400 whippings, 6 murders, and several schoolhouses and black churches that had been burned down. He had solid evidence against 8 men and circumstantial evidence against many more. Everyone knew in this small town who'd done the deeds. Everyone except for the whites who served on the coroner's jury, who were just mystified. Then the KKK nightriders brazenly lynched Jim Williams, the Negro captain of the local state militia. They proclaimed that he was being lynched for voting for the radical ticket. When his wife heard strangling noises, she opened the door and begged them not to harm her husband, but they told her to shut the door and put her children to bed. And Jim Williams was found swinging from a pine tree. Major Merrill learned when the KKK was next planning to ride to terrorize the blacks of the county. He asked the sheriff if he could accompany his troops to catch these nightriders in the act, so he could arrest them. The sheriff agreed initially, but then his feet went cold. He made excuses and declined to participate. How could our brave Major Merrill combat this evil? He devised a plan. He asked one of the town's prominent lawyers, a former Confederate colonel, to call a meeting of several of the town leaders to discuss what could be done, fully expecting that several of them were also leaders in the KKK themselves. Our author recounts these leading town leaders came to his office at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and the major proceeded ever so politely to make it clear that he knew everything that they were up to. He described in minute detail the recent KKK raids, making it clear that they could do nothing without him learning of it, implying strongly that they were informers in their own ranks and that they could trust no one. Now, he bluffed, saying he was expecting to hear from President Grant that he was suspending the writ of habeas corpus in the town, authorizing him to put under military arrest the guilty parties. Then he convinced them to place in the newspaper a notice signed by several hundred leading citizens of the town denouncing the violence and terror being spread by the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this neither shamed nor dissuaded the good citizens of Yorkville, South Carolina. The violence continued. Major Merrill added to his evidence file. There were more beatings. Some threatened lynchings. Major Merrill telegraphed his superior for permission to arrest the members of the KKK. He received no answer. Not only were those who worked on the railroad conspiring with the KKK, so also were the telegraph operators. And the leaders of the KKK knew the contents of any telegrams sent and received by our good Major. But some justice served at last. Major Merrill sent letters to his superiors in the Army describing his frustrating and futile attempts to safeguard basic civil rights, due process under law, and simple justice in York County on behalf of the freed slaves. These appeals, and likely many others, went up the chain of command. The colored South Carolina Republican congressman courageously visited York. Congress held hearings on the civil rights abuses in York County and other localities in South Carolina. One noteworthy witness was the bravest, most helpless, and most sympathetic witness imaginable. Our author recalls, it was the testimony of Elias Hill that cast a hush over the room. His life was a latter-day story of Job. He was a cripple, with shriveled legs no bigger than a child's, an arm drawn up and perpetually frozen in rheumatic pain. He was carried into the hearing room and set up in a chair. When he began to speak, it was a strong and melodious voice, the voice of a preacher. The crippled boy learned how to read and write and became a school teacher to the other children, and for 10 years had been preaching in a Baptist church. His family and the colored people who lived nearby helped take care of him, helped him eat his meals, and carried him everywhere he went. One night our shriveled little cripple was bullied by the KKK nightriders. "Where's Elias?" shouted the white-hooded men. Our author relates, a rough hand grabbed his withered arm and threw him on the ground outside. The men then pummeled him with their fists, and a pistol butt jerked his painfully atrophied legs, ordered him to pull up his shirt, and horsewhipped him 8 cuts on his hip, and finally put a leather strap around his neck and said they were going to throw him in the river and drown him. They demanded he renounce the Republican Party and halt his preaching, but finally they relented, permitting his sister-in-law to lay him on his bed, giving her a couple of parting lashes with a leather strap. And this was excerpted from his testimony before the committee. These were some of his responses to the cross-examination. Question: You do not feel very kindly towards the white race? Answer: I'm afraid of them now. Question: Frightened of them? Answer: Yes, sir. I have and show goodwill, love, and affection toward them, but I fear them. And the good citizens of Yorkville insisted they would enforce their laws, so a grand jury was called, and the judge informed the grand jury that it was their duty to listen to the testimony of Major Merrill. Our author tells us the whole town was in on the joke and decided to help it along. Many prominent citizens of Yorkville signed a petition to President Grant declaring that no outrages had occurred in their county for the past month, although Merrill's reports showed that there had been at least 10 incidents, including 1 murder. And the grand jury proceedings were compromised. Informers informed Major Merrill that a third of the grand jury members and 3 trial justices belonged to the KKK, and 2 grand jury members were accessories to KKK murders. There were whisperings that the grand jury would later prove that the War Department had been deceived by Major Merrill, but he called their bluff by providing evidence for over 100 violent crimes and murders. And the next month, General Grant, under the provisions of the recently passed Enforcement Act, ordered the Ku Klux Klan to disperse within 5 days and turn in all weapons, disguises, and paraphernalia. The federal government could suspend the writ of habeas corpus and send the army to make arrests on its own authority. Shortly afterwards, an additional infantry and 2 cavalry divisions arrived in Yorkville to assist in enforcing this law, and the habeas corpus was suspended in 9 counties in South Carolina, including York County. Our author tells us, 2 days later, Major Merrill sent squadrons of cavalry galloping across York County to arrest 82 men, almost simultaneously and without incident. He made a point of sending them in broad daylight, arresting the prisoners in town or at their places of work. There would be no midnight knocks on doors, no accusations of men being torn from their families under cover of darkness. No hundreds confess, but most are pardoned. These prisoners overwhelmed the 2nd and 3rd floors of the local jail. There was not enough room in the cells, even with most prisoners sleeping on the floor. Many were compelled to sleep in the corridors. Our author writes, the locals called confession puking. Another 500 men puked, turning themselves in, while several hundred, including many ringleaders, fled the county. Many men who agreed to testify in court insisted on being arrested, so it looked like their testimony was forced. Major Merrill hired a stenographer who had difficulties recording all the testimonies. So many men turned themselves in that our major had no choice but to take their confessions and send them home on their own parole, holding only those who confessed to the most heinous of crimes. And the prisoners were transferred to Columbia, South Carolina for trial in the United States Court. In Columbia, the prisoners were out-and-out heroes. The ladies of the city called regularly with sparkling conversation. The reverend doctors and students of the theological seminary came with words of solace, which meant that the white Christian clergy condoned KKK terrorism. And a famous fire-eating secessionist came with a 5-gallon keg of beer and stirring oratory. Well, gentlemen, we are all in jail in South Carolina. The only difference is you are under shelter, and those of us who are on the outside have to dodge the storm as best we can. When the trial commenced, most of the defendants pleaded guilty. Most of the leaders had already fled. The Ku Klux Klan Constitution was read into evidence. It swore its members to secrecy on penalty of death, swore them to oppose the Radical Party, swore them to fight for the Constitution as bequeathed to us in its purity by our forefathers, denying the validity of the Reconstruction Amendments guaranteeing blacks freedom, due process under the law, and the right to vote. Courtroom testimony was graphic and compelling. Our author writes, "Colored witnesses told of being whipped and threatened for having voted the Republican ticket. 'Damn you, we'll make you a Democrat of you tonight,' his assailants told one man as they beat him. A colored woman described her rape in such graphic terms that the court reporter noted that it was of too obscene a nature to permit of publication. When the guilty defendants lined up to receive their sentencing, our author states that Judge Bond was indignant, but his options were limited. Judge Bond addressed them. Some of your comrades recite the circumstances of a brutal, unprovoked murder done by themselves, with as little apparent abhorrence as you would relate the incidents of a picnic. And you yourself speak of the number of blows with a hickory which you inflicted at midnight upon the lacerated, bleeding back of a defenseless woman, without so much as a blush or a sign of regret. There were so many defendants that most were either fined up to $100 while some were sentenced for a few months. While the trial was proceeding, officials in Washington were tiring of the intransigence of the hundreds of defendants. They had other priorities. Most Northern whites were prejudiced towards blacks also. Our author notes, the Army commanders were antsy to get the cavalry back to its business fighting the Indians out west, to get out of the degrading business of acting like so many police constables down south. The United States courts couldn't possibly handle the hundreds of pending cases anyway, not with one judge riding the circuit and funds so short that the district attorney could not even hire a stenographer. And the lack of enthusiasm led to many defendants being pardoned. Only serious cases like murder would be tried and or sentenced. Troop morale broke down in Yorkville after many soldiers were sent west. Eventually, the rest of the troops were pulled out. Major Merrill was given a year's sick leave and then sent to Dakota for a few months, but then transferred to Louisiana, where a real war had broken out. A war that was also being fought by the former Confederate General Longstreet, formerly a Civil War hero, whose popularity had plummeted when he served in the Federal Army battling the forces of white supremacy. In our next video, we will discuss the next Reconstruction era posting of Major Merrill and how he and the former Confederate General Longstreet confronted the white leaders, which was another white supremacist group similar to the KKK in Louisiana. What did I realize when reading this remarkable story of the career of Major Merrill? I was reminded of a Rotary talk I heard by Stetson Kennedy, who had infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan in the 50s. He points out that in its heyday, when a large chunk of the young males were members of the KKK, for many it was a social outlet and a way to get away from the nagging wife. And this partially explains why on most of the night rides, they usually beat and terrorized the blacks they bullied. Murders and lynchings only happened on occasional midnight rides. We should also realize that many Northern whites were prejudiced against blacks, and that the Reconstruction Amendments protecting the civil rights of blacks were emasculated by the Southern-dominated Supreme Court after the end of the Reconstruction era. And indeed, the only reason why the Reconstruction Amendments were ratified at all was because the North compelled the Southern states to ratify them as a condition for readmission into the Union, ending their military rule under the United States Army troops. We have other videos discussing how broad swaths of white Southerners and Christians wanted to deny that free blacks were human beings worthy to associate with white people. There are historical memories of white Christians attending lynching festivals that are not only public, but have been publicized and are conveniently scheduled after Sunday morning church services. Many whites don't want to hear that there are over 10,000 lynchings where mostly innocent blacks were hanged and sometimes burned and their corpses hacked into pieces and sold as souvenirs. There was also widespread use of the peonage statutes, where innocent blacks were arrested for vagrancy for standing on street corners and were being impressed into involuntary labor under atrocious and sometimes fatal working conditions, which was really slavery under another name. Plus, we have the general histories of Reconstruction and Jim Crow Redemptionist era by the renowned author and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, and also a summary of the Yale lectures on the black history of these eras. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.